Hi, my name is Avril Sauter and we're talking about CCNA Wireless. One of the most important aspects of deploying a wireless network is to make sure that it is secure, relevant to your business needs. Well, the first thing is to recognize is that Wi-Fi operates in the unlicensed frequency bands. And other technologies also operate in that band. So you've got Bluetooth, microwave ovens, those operate in the 2.4 gigahertz band, and you'll find cordless phones and other wireless devices also operating in the 5 gigahertz band, although a lot less than in the 2.4. And so you're competing for using that spectrum. And in order to use the spectrum, the first thing you need to do is to be able to listen and see whether it's clear or not. And so there's a lot of technologies out there that are actually fairly cheap that you can buy that will listen on the 2.4 gigahertz band and the 5 gigahertz band. So having your spectrum open and unlicensed is great because it means so many different technologies can innovate and use that spectrum. But of course, then you have to be concerned about, is that spectrum going to be available? Is there going to be a lot of interference in there? And then there's the issue of users can actually create and disrupt your Wi-Fi network. And let me give you a for instance. Let's say in a corporate setting and I bring in my tablet or PC, and today I can set that up as an access point and I can be connecting my other wireless devices to it using the 802.11 protocol. And so effectively I've created a small basic service set. And that basic service set will be operating on a channel, and it's quite possible that that can cause interference with your Wi-Fi deployment that you have in your corporate setting. And other times you can actually get intentional attacks. So like a denial of service attack, where people actually go to attack your network and try to disrupt it from operating. And we're going to talk more about that in a moment. Because it's wireless, because it's over the air, is a lot easier to monitor. If you're trying to monitor a wired network, you almost have to tap into the wire itself. Whereas wireless networks, well, you can just open up your laptop or your radio and start listening. Now, the first thing we want to worry about is users that are attempting to gain access to the wireless network. For instance, a lot of people will just drive around and see if they can find a free Wi-Fi network and connect to it. And of course, they're using the bandwidth of that person's Wi-Fi network. And also, when people connect to a free network or someone else's network because it's unprotected, you don't know quite what kind of traffic that they're going to send on it. And to give you an example, there was a recent case where someone had an open Wi-Fi network at their home and someone else had got on and had made threats to the police. And they actually had a SWAT team turn up at this home expecting to find somebody that was making quite serious threats to the police. And of course it wasn't anybody in the home, it was somebody using that network which was unsecured. And then you have actual people that will actually make attacks on people's networks to try and get in and gain some sensitive information. So they'll take advantage of corporations that haven't quite secured their networks tight enough, and they get in and look for credit card information, etc., potentially gain enough information to then say, okay, here's how I can penetrate and get into the network. So when you're looking at the Wi-Fi networks, you always want to move to the higher security techniques, and we're going to talk more about WPA and WPA2 later on. But if you leave your network as completely open or use the web encryption, then your network is very likely to be attacked. Now, there are lots of hacking tools out there for Wi-Fi. If you have web deployed, it's possible to download one of these applications and to get into your network within minutes at the most. And so these are very simple tools, very easy to use, don't require a sophisticated hacker. So if you go up to WPA, then you need much more sophisticated tools to try and penetrate into the network. But leaving it as open authentication and web is extremely dangerous today in terms of leaving your network as very vulnerable. So social engineering is a technique where people will talk to people with the information on how to access the network and be able to extract that information from the individual. So for instance, they may say, hey, I'm a little bit lost and I really need to get in my work today and I can't quite remember the access code to Wi-Fi. Can you help me out here? And people are good-natured in general, and they will help somebody if they seem to be in distress and needing some support, without realizing those people shouldn't be able to get into the network. And this is what we call social engineering. The other thing that can expose a corporate network is when people bring in their personal devices and connect them onto the network, maybe a tablet or a smartphone or a laptop. And quite often those laptops will come in with viruses and Trojan horses and other things, and that can actually enable a hacker that has been the cause of you getting that virus or that device then to penetrate into the corporate network. So going beyond your device and then into the corporate network. And that's a significant issue with today, because a lot of corporations are wanting people to use their personal devices because they can get to be more productive. And this is where the Cisco AnyConnect and ASA software comes into play. And we talked about that in another module. So a rogue access point is simply an AP, an access point, that has been connected to your wired infrastructure without you knowing about it. So for instance, an employee, specifically in labs or just someone working on their desk, will come into the office and just plop the access point on their desk and connect it into the corporate network, and then be able to connect through that access point with their wireless devices. And they just don't realize that they're opening up the corporate network to be vulnerable. Now, the worst kind of rogue access point is what's labeled here as the hostile access point, because this one is one that an attacker has actually deliberately put on the network, on the wired network, in order to gain access into your network. And these can be very, very discreet. You know, some of the latest access points, they're tiny and they just plug into a plug socket somewhere in the building. And you'd almost think they're an air freshener. You wouldn't even recognize them as an access point. And so they can be very difficult to actually physically spot. So what a hacker does is they'd put that AP on a different channel and they'd set it with the same SSID as you're using in your corporation, and then wireless clients would try to connect to it. And if that hacker access point gives that client that's trying to connect to it an IP address, so it thinks, oh, you know, this is a real valid access point, then basically it's taken over that client in the network, and then it can use that information with that client to try and attack the network. A neighboring access point is something in a adjoining building that's impacting the performance of your network. It's meant to be there, it is a valid network, but it's impacting your network's ability to run. A rogue peer is when you have a workstation that has wireless and bridging enabled. And so what's going to happen there, they can connect wirelessly, but then they can bridge between other networks and other devices, and so exposing your network to having other traffic come through it over the wireless network. And ad hoc networks, I personally think, are the most dangerous. If ever you go to an airport and you see an ad hoc network, please don't ever connect to it. So these are the ones where it's just between PCs. And so you'll connect to it. Quite often they're open and free. And sometimes your laptop might even be set up to say, hey, I'm operating in an ad hoc mode, and you may have people connect to you that you don't know are connecting to you. So why are rogue devices so bad? Well, the best case scenario is that they cause you interference and they impact your performance. The worst case scenario is that they expose a security hole and allow somebody to get in to your corporate network. Once they get into your corporate network, there's lots of things that can happen. One, you may run into some regulatory compliance issues if you, for instance, have personal data on your network. Your data could be destroyed or given to the competition. Your reputation could be damaged. And then, of course, it weakens your ability to actually enforce any security policies that you want to apply on your network. So let's talk about some of the security measures one can do to overcome some of the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of a wireless network. So the first thing that protects a wireless network from being compromised is use of authentication and authorization, and then also accounting, so your AAA servers and protocols. So authentication is basically the process of validating the identity of the person that's requesting access. Now there are multiple authentication methods, and some are more secure than others. And so here's a picture here that says username and password. Other techniques would be a smart card. You could use biometrics like a fingerprint. So there's a lot of different ways that you can validate the identity of someone. If you're using a AAA Radius server or functional component, that also offers authorization. And authorization is basically saying what actions can that user perform on the network. A lot of companies will actually manage that through a directory service such as Microsoft Active Directory, which maintains a list of users and a list of group policies that are then applied to those users. And the accounting function is really the record of what the user accessed, for how long, etc. Now, where is authentication done? Well, it really does depend. It can be done locally. It can be done on the access point, on the switch or router, or it can be done on the wireless LAN controller. So part of setting your network up will be to say, where do you want to validate the credentials of this user? And it may be different for different users. So for instance, the way that you authenticate employees versus guests can be different. Alternatively, you might want to use an authentication server where you're storing the credentials of the users and their passwords, etc. And the advantage of doing it on an authentication server is you can start to get ubiquity between your wireless and your wireline networks. So authentication says, okay, this user is allowed in my network and these are the resources that they're able to access. Encryption then protects the data and prevents it being read by a third party unless they have the secret keys. And it does it simply by scrambling the information. Now, encryption is really used for protecting the privacy and confidentiality of your data. One of the other security concerns is, did anybody tamper with the data? And so quite often you may not worry too much about the encryption. I don't mind if someone knows that I bought a book, for instance, but I might mind if they change the order from 1 book to 10 books. And so integrity is a way of making sure that the data that you're sending has not been changed. And normally how that's dealt with is with a hashing key, which adds a small code or a sequence of ones and zeros at the end of your frame to say, this frame should generate these ones and zeros, and if it doesn't, then someone's tampered with it. So there are different types of encryption. Local, for instance, this is where you might encrypt your disk. This type of encryption normally encrypts the entire content of a disk or volume of the disk, and then it decrypts it and encrypts it during use. But this type of encryption doesn't protect your data when it's sent over the network. It just protects it for where it's locally stored. Now, when it comes to encryption of email, you can encrypt the file that you attach to your email, or you can encrypt the whole message. Of course, the recipient needs a way of decrypting the file when it arrives. But there are a couple of well-known encryption techniques such as PGP. And PGP actually also allows you to digitally sign your email, and this technology can be downloaded for free, so it's a very good commercial option. And then you've got the concept of encrypting information while it's actually going across the network, and this is perhaps the most common and most important use of encryption. And one of the most popular ones is the Secure Socket Layer, SSL, and that's used to encrypt web traffic. And then a more general form of encrypting over the network is IPsec, but it requires configuration between two computers that are actually communicating to one another. Now, when it comes to wireless, what you typically see is it protects over the air only. So it protects just between the client and the access point. So it's basically preventing snooping over the wireless, and then once it leaves the access point onto the wired network, it is not encrypted. And that's what we refer to here as partial wireless LAN. That's what WEP, the Wired Equivalency Privacy Protocol, and also WPA, the Wi-Fi Protected Access Protocols do. It is purely over the air to prevent sniffing or snooping by people. After it gets to the access point, it is not encrypted. So encryption, if you want to go from the client to the server, or site to site, or between remote access, then you're really looking at using IPsec, SSL, setting up a VPN on top of the wireless encryption. So when you're thinking of protecting your wireless network, you want to think over the air or end to end, or which part of the network do I really want to see encrypted? Do I already have secure tunnels of my wired network and I just need to extend them to the wireless? So there's a lot of consideration when you think about how to apply the encryption to wireless networks. So we talked about authentication and encryption. The other thing that can mitigate security threats is intrusion detection, and what this is when you put sensors in the network that analyze the network traffic. And what they're looking for is they're looking for malicious behavior, something that says, hey, this isn't quite right, I think this might be a potential attack. When it comes to things like denial of service attacks, what the intrusion detection is doing is looking for what's referred to as signatures, certain patterns of behavior. And these signatures are normally updated on a regular basis, just like your viruses are updated on a regular basis. This is a new form of attack, a new form of signature. And you look for those signatures by analyzing the traffic, and when you see it happening, you flag it as a potential attack. The big issue here is always balancing between identifying potential attacks and not identifying so many that they get ignored. And when you identify so many and they're not actually an attack, then that's called a false positive. And so somehow you have to find the right balance between making sure you don't set off a lot of false positives, but you're tracking as many of the attacks that you can be. Intrusion prevention is my favorite because, it just doesn't sense it and say, okay, there's a potential attack here, flag it, send an alert. Intrusion prevention will actually respond back and take a course of action, and so it can be real time. For instance, if it detects that there's a rogue access point, it can actually send messages to clients to get them to disassociate, so they start looking for other access points to connect to. Now there's always a risk here that it shuts off a valid user or something which really wasn't an attack. And again, there's a happy balance here between disrupting some users because you're taking action, at the same time protecting your corporate network from attack from outside. So the last thing we want to talk about here is security policies. Everybody has security policies. Not everybody writes their security policies down. And the main thing here is to define what the policy is and then to train people to execute against that policy. Now, a good security policy can prevent the social engineering attacks that I mentioned. It could be preventing improper network access. So forcing, for instance, clients that connect to your network to have antivirus software in it. So when it comes to security policies, it's really important to identify what you're trying to protect, then to define the policies that you think are reasonable for protecting that data, and then to write down those policies and then to train your users to enforce those policies. If you haven't heard of SANS, I would certainly recommend it, System Authorization Networking and Security Institute, and they have templates for security policies, including wireless ones. Some terminology here that you should feel comfortable with. Policies, those are kind of like high-level statements that relate to how to protect corporate assets, such as their information. It'll define roles and responsibilities and scopes, etc. Guidelines are really recommendations. A guideline might be, for instance, that your passwords should expire after 30 days. Standards, on the other hand, is where you enforce consistency across your enterprise. When you say, this is how we're going to implement it. And so, for an instance, you would say, my passwords always must be of length 8 and include a non-numeric character. When you look at a business practice, here's a sample of some of the policies that are up on SANS and some of the ones that you should consider doing. These relate equally to your wired and your wireless networks. So now we've covered a bit of an introduction into wireless security. Let's now focus in on the Wi-Fi wireless LAN authentication. So let's talk about the different authentication types. And here I want to go and talk about legacy, so then we can talk about what is new with 802.11i. So going way back, one of the types of authentication we had was open authentication, and as the name suggests, that means no authentication. For instance, a lot of coffee shops, cafes, airports, hotels will offer open access to their hotspots. If you're deploying in one of those environments, when you configure the wireless LAN on your wireless LAN controller, assuming that you're using lightweight access points, then you would simply select the No Security in the Security tabs. And then what will happen is illustrated here on the picture on the right. The client will send an authentication request in, and they'll have an authentication response that says, yes, you're authenticated. The next type of authentication is what we call shared authentication, and this is where I need to have a key, and you often find this in airport lounges or hotels where you say, can I have access to the Wi-Fi, and they hand you over a piece of paper with a key written on it, and you then key that in when you connect to the network, and it says, oh, you've got the shared key, you must be valid, and therefore I'm going to authenticate you on the network. Now when we look at a shared authentication, and here I'm looking at the WEP process, because again I'm looking at legacy authentication, and this was a basic 4-step process. I'd say, hey, it's me, want to be authenticated, here's my request, and then I get a response back saying, hey, I want to challenge you. Are you really allowed on my network? And then I respond back with a challenge response. And I use my secret piece of information to create the challenge response. When the network receives that challenge response, it says, wow, you must have that secret piece of information because otherwise you couldn't have responded to my challenge in that way. So therefore you must be the person you say you are, and therefore I will respond back with an authorization response that says, yes, you are now authenticated on the network. Now there's MAC address authentication. Now if you do this, and some corporations still do this, you really want to be in a lightweight mode of operation, because what I'm going to do here is I'm going to maintain a list of MAC addresses that are allowed to connect to my network. And so if you were dealing with autonomous mode access points, you'd have to key in those MAC addresses on every access point. In a lightweight mode, you can maintain this in the wireless LAN controller. When you try to connect, I've got your MAC address of the device that you're connecting with, and I say, is that device allowed to connect on my network? Is that device in my list? The problem is that although this sounds great, it's actually quite a weak authentication method, and many people will use this coupled with other authentication mechanisms. And the reason is that if I listen over the air to the MAC messages going backwards and forwards between your device and the access point, then it's possible for me to find out what the MAC addresses are of legitimate clients, and then I can change my MAC address on my client to be a legitimate MAC address, i.e. I spoof the MAC address. So now we're going to talk about what was introduced with 802.11i specifications. And the 802.11i specifications took a while to go through and be finalized. And because people were concerned in the industry about security, they said, well, why don't we introduce WPA based on the draft 802.11i specifications, and once the specifications are finalized, we can amend it if we need to. And so WPA was introduced ahead of the standards finalizing, and it was designed to replace WEP. There's WPA Personal and WPA Enterprise. WPA Personal uses a shared secret key, i.e. a paraphrase. With WPA Enterprise, I actually use 802.1x port authentication, and then I use EAP on top of that. And the way I do authentication will be using an EAP method which runs on top of the EAP protocol. WPA2 conforms to the 802.11i specification, and in fact WPA also conforms to that specification, but WPA2 came out after it was finalized. It continues to have the Personal and the Enterprise, WPA2 Personal and WPA2 Enterprise. Now, many corporations that don't want to deploy 802.1x, and when I say corporations, I'm talking about small businesses that perhaps don't have a large IT department, 802.1x can sometimes be a little bit cumbersome to deploy, and so a lot of smaller businesses will actually deploy WPA2 Personal, as do people in their home environment. The diagram at the bottom of this slide shows a pretty classic deployment in an enterprise environment where I'll connect through a lightweight access point. The lightweight access point will route all of my traffic, including my authentication request, to the wireless LAN controller, and then the wireless LAN controller in this scenario talks to a Cisco Secure ACS server, where ACS stands for Secure Control System, and that will then validate that I am who I say I am. And then once I've validated, yes, it really is me, the wireless LAN controller will then say, oh, this person is now successfully authenticated. So once you're successfully authenticated, then the keys are distributed across the network using the 802.1x process. And so how that works is that the supplicant, i.e. the client, and the authentication server both have the master key. They use the master key to generate a pairwise master key. And the pairwise master key is sent to the authenticator, which in this scenario is the lightweight access point. The pairwise master key is kept for the entire session that the client is connected to the access point. And I use the pairwise master key to establish pairwise transient keys. And as the word suggests, the transient keys change periodically, whereas the pairwise master key is meant to be static for the duration of the connection. The AP uses the pairwise transient keys to do a four-way handshake, and this is used by the client to validate that this is a valid network. And so what it does is it sends a nonce, which is just a number, a random number, which is generated and sent to the supplicant. At that point in time, the client can now generate the PTK. The client sends a nonce back, which is a random number, to the authenticator, which then calculates its PTK. At this point in time, both the station and the client has the PTK, and at this point in time, they can now generate the group temporal keys. The group temporal keys are the ones that's used to encrypt multicast or broadcast messages, so they're shared between different users as opposed to the pairwise transient keys. So once this process is finished, both the authenticator, i.e. the lightweight access point, and the supplicant have keys to encrypt the data over the wireless network. And remember, when we encrypt on wireless LANs using WPA2, we're only encrypting over the air. We're not encrypting end to end. So let me talk a little bit about the authentication methods that are supported by Cisco's equipment. So the 802.1x protocol. So there is a supplicant, which is your client device. There is the authenticator, which in a lightweight mode access point is the access point. And then there is a AAA radio server, which is the authentication server. And that authentication server could be in the AP, could be in the wireless LAN controller. It could be external to the wireless LAN controller and be a completely separate server. So if we look at the basic EAP messaging that goes backwards and forwards, the client will make a request for access. The client is then asked to identify itself. The client then provides credentials to say, this proves who I am, and then that is forwarded to the server, who then says, oh, okay, I recognize that, or I don't recognize that, and it will either say, yes, it's successful, or no, it's failed to authenticate. It's very high-level basic messaging. Well, in the next few slides, we want to talk about the EAP authentication types, and we're going to start here talking about a couple that were developed by Cisco. The first one is LEAP, and this was developed prior to the 802.11 standards being ratified and prior to the Wi-Fi Alliance certification program called the Wi-Fi Protected Access, WPA. And so Cisco developed this protocol to address some of the security vulnerabilities of WEP ahead of 802.11i. Now that 802.11 has been ratified and that you have WPA and WPA2, but largely it's not considered secure and it has some vulnerabilities. Now EAP-Fast was a protocol which basically creates a secure tunnel. And then within that secure tunnel, you can then run different authentication methods, and it supports things like MS-CHAP, GTC, and TLS. FAST actually stands for Flexible Authentication via Secure Tunneling, and its goal was to kind of keep it as simple and as lightweight as the lightweight EAP. And we'll talk about PEEP in a moment, but to distinguish FAST from PEEP, FAST does not require any certificates, whereas PEEP does. However, it does require a authentication server. So the way this works is that you keep your protected access credentials, your PAC, on an authentication server, so like a AAA server, and the client and the server will mutually authenticate each other, and once they've authenticated each other, they establish a secure tunnel. This is sometimes called outer authentication, because once you've authenticated between the client and the Radius server, then the inner authentication can take place, and thus takes place within the tunnel. And let me give you a for instance on this one. So you might do EAP Fast, and then within that tunnel you may do MS Chap. And MS Chap is a username password authentication. MS Chap has been heavily criticized for dictionary type of attacks. And so by putting it inside a tunnel, then it prevents those kind of dictionary attacks on it. Now, EAP Fast is supported on most of the access points that Cisco has, and is used in the enterprise environment where you have a AAA server. So let's talk a little bit about PEEP. PEEP stands for Protected EAP, and it creates a secure tunnel as the outer authentication, and then carries within it then the inner authentication. And so the outer layer is created using the Transport Layer Security TLS protocol, and it uses digital certificates, but it only requires a digital certificate at the server. It does not require one from the client. And so it sets up a secure tunnel and prevents a man-in-the-middle attack. And once PEEP is set up, then you could do security within it. And there are two versions of PEEP. The first one is PEEP MS Chap version 2, sometimes referred to as Microsoft PEEP. And it's really for carrying the MS Chap 2 protocol. The other type was PEEP GTC, and this uses token cards and would be more vendor independent than using MS Chap. I've never seen much deployment of a GTP. It's not widely deployed, and Microsoft really encourages people to use the fast EAP. So let's now talk about EAP TLS. Now this one actually requires both the client and the Radius server to authenticate themselves using some form of public key cryptography, such as digital certificates. And once they've talked to each other and confirmed each other's certificates, then they set up a secure tunnel. And then within the secure tunnel you can do user authentication. The problem with this is that the client has to have a certificate as well. And because of that, most people lean towards PEEP or EAP Fast. So a lot of people, say, well, what is a digital certificate? And digital certificates, this is an example of an X509 digital certificate where X509 is the standard for how a digital certificate should be formatted. And it's simply digital documents where the owner says, I'm really who I say I am. And they are signed by a trusted certificate authority. And so when you see a trusted certificate authority, you believe that the digital certificate is correct. Now, obtaining a digital certificate can actually be quite expensive. It can be in the hundreds of dollars. And so many organizations will either create their own private certificate authority, or else they use an alternative protocol. It's simply to save the cost of having to have a digital certificate for the clients and for the servers. Thank you for listening.